Well, good morning, everybody. This week is almost over. I hope you're getting excited about being in God's house Sunday to worship, and I hope you're also excited about inviting people to come to church, to come to Life Group, and to worship Jesus with you. So be sure to invite someone. Don't come alone. Bring somebody with you. Today in our Bible reading plan, we are in the third chapter of the book of Amos. And the verse that spoke to my heart when reading this chapter, because it's really kind of a hard chapter. I mean, it's rough. But the verse that spoke to me is verse 14. He says, For on the day that I punish Israel's transgressions. We talked yesterday about their sin and how God was going to judge them. And here he says, on the day that God does that, verse 14, I will also punish the altars of Bethel. The horns of the altar will be cut off and they will fall to the ground. Now, what is that talking about? Well, we read about it a few weeks ago in 1 Kings chapter 12, starting at verses 28 and following, after the civil war that divided the nation of Israel into two countries, the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel, or later also known as Samaria. Their very first king, Jeroboam, who had been Solomon's general, and he becomes king, the first king of the north. Jeroboam, to keep people from going to the south to the temple to worship God, because he was afraid that would cause them to want to abandon the north and reunite the two countries, and he didn't want that to happen. So he created this false religion, and he built shrines in two locations, one in Dan and the other in Bethel, and had craftsmen prepare two idols, golden calves, and he placed one in Dan and he placed one at Bethel. And this is where the Jewish people in the north would go to worship this idol, this pagan religion that Jeroboam, their first king, had created. And we've seen already in recent days how God condemned that sin. And so what he's saying in verse 14 is when God finally judges the northern kingdom of Israel or Samaria, those places of worship where those two idols were located, those golden calves, will be destroyed. And so he says, I will punish the altars of Bethel. Bethel is one of those locations. And the horns of the altar on that golden calf will be cut off and fall to the ground. God says, I'm going to wipe that religion, that false religion. I'm going to wipe those shrines. I'm going to wipe those idols away. Part of my judgment is I'm going to destroy that place. Now, that actually happened in 722 BC, about 30 to 40 years after Amos preached. Amos preached in the 760s, 750s BC, 722. The Assyrians obliterated the northern kingdom of Samaria, or Israel, and carried most of the people away as slaves, resettled them in other parts of the world. And so 30 to 40 years after Amos preached this, what he said in verse 14 actually happened. And as I was thinking about all this, I also got to thinking about Jeroboam, that first king of the north who built those places of worship and those idols and put them there. When did that happen? That was around 930 BC. So I want you to think about something. It was just a little over maybe 170, 160 years after Jeroboam erected those idols and places of false worship in Bethel and Dan. About 160, 170 years later, Amos preached what he did in verse 14 that we read, that those altars are going to be destroyed. It was a little over 200 years after Jeroboam had those built and put at Bethel and Dan, a little over 200 years when God actually destroyed the northern kingdom and destroyed those altars and places of worship there at Bethel and Dan, as alluded to in chapter 3, verse 14. Now, what that said to me is when we talk about the patience of God, He really is a patient God. I mean, God sent prophets to the northern kingdom from the time of Jeroboam right down to Amos in 722 when it was destroyed. God sent prophets. Isaiah being one of the last ones before the destruction of the northern kingdom. And they were warned, and God judged them and disciplined them all along the way, but he did not destroy them until just a touch over 200 years had passed. That's the patience of God, giving them opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to repent, to change, and to become faithful. God is a patient God. And that made one of the verses we looked at yesterday mean so much more to me. In chapter 2, verse 13, you'll remember God saying, I am weighed down by your sin, like filling a wagon full of stuff makes it heavy. And God says, your sin, and it's like after 200 years, God said, I'm tired of carrying the weight of this nation's sin. And he judged them. But he's patient. 200 years is a long time. The patience of God, so amazing. So amazing. Another thing it says to me, though, is that eventually every false religion, every false philosophy will eventually be destroyed. And the one true God will reign, and every competitor, which is a false competitor, will vanish. So make certain you are committed to the right thing. And don't take God's patience with you for granted, because God is patient with you. But sooner or later, he'll lay down the load of your sin and discipline and judge. Don't abuse the patience of God. That's the word for today. I'll see you tomorrow.